In this video, I'll take a quick look at some of the other renderers that ship with 3ds Max. Right now, for this project, we're using Mental Ray, but there are others that may be advantageous depending on the look you're after. I'll pull up the Render Setup, clicking on the Render Setup button or pressing F10. Down at the bottom of the common parameters, there's the Assign Renderer Rollout. At the moment, we're using NVIDIA Mental Ray. If I click on the Choose Renderer button, we can see available the default scanline, NVIDIA iRay, the Quicksilver Hardware Renderer, and the View File Renderer. The default scanline is one of the oldest renderers around that ships with 3ds Max, and is a very good renderer except for one big thing. There's no way with the default scanline renderer on its own to bounce light. Switching to the default scanline means that we can no longer use the Archon Design materials. We need to use standard Max materials. Some of the things are fairly common. The Renderer tab, for example, where we're controlling anti-aliasing and what kind of blur we're using. Ray tracing. Are we using it or not, and how are we handling it? Advanced lighting covers different ways of dealing with some bounce light, radiosity, and a light tracer, which truthfully I used to use quite some years back when doing renderings. It's a good renderer, and the place to become familiar with this is if you'd like to understand some of how game engines function. A lot of them are in some ways similar to the scanline renderer in the way things behave. For now though, I'll switch over. I'll try iRay and click OK. My tabs are reduced. Common is still the same, but the Renderer tab looks different. The idea in iRay is we're utilizing the power of the graphics card, and we're setting a time to render. In here we can decide, are we bouncing light, and how much, what is our anti-aliasing, as before, and what kind of hardware resources. You can see my graphics card available here, and how many processors I'd like to allot to it. When you click Render using the iRay renderer, what happens is that it will start rendering immediately as soon as it loads in the scene and the images, and put up a render as quick as possible, and then continue to refine it as well as it can. It's thinking very hard in the background. We can see it's baked the textures, and now it's starting in on the render. The advantage to this is if you have a very powerful graphics card, this may be a very quick render. The disadvantage is that some things may look slightly odd and need some particular tuning to use iRay. It's a neat way to go, in that it will render as much as it can within that minute, and then let you add further processing if you'd like. You can play with this if you'd like. What I'll do, just to be able to show an example, and a neat way to work, is rather than render it full size, I'll go in the Common tab and take this image size down. I'll put in 640 by 360 and see how it looks. Additionally, it's asking me if I'd like to overwrite the file. To avoid that, I can simply uncheck Save File and hit Render again. This should go a little faster. It's baking the textures and we'll start in on the render. My render is done, and it doesn't quite look like my scene. I can see a little bit of the ticket booth, and the reason for this is I haven't allotted a ton of time for it. I've let it do unlimited bounces, but in the render time up here at the top, I've only let it go for a minute. The neat part is that it will keep resolving that light as long as we let it happen if we care to experiment with it. I'll switch over to another render. You can experiment with iRay if you'd like. I'll click on the Choose Renderer button down in the Assign Renderer Rollout, and I'll choose the Quicksilver Hardware Renderer and click OK. Instead of using the graphics card and producing a calculation of light that simply carries on for quite some time, the Quicksilver Hardware Renderer is actually the same idea in rendering as the Nitrous viewports. When we press F3 to go to a shaded view, or go to Realistic, for example, and check Lighting and Shadows, Illuminate with Scene Lights, the lights that we're using here are the same ones that the Quicksilver Hardware Renderer will display, and in the same way. In this way, it's very much like seeing what you see is what you get, and is a great way to really quickly preview a design. Under Renderer then, once I've solved the size, I can put in either a specified time or a number of iterations. How many times will it make a pass at a frame? I can also choose a rendering level. And these are the same rendering levels that we see in our viewport configuration. Realistic, shaded, ink, stylized, graphite, colored pencil, and so forth. When I choose up here in the viewport things like stylized and ink, for example, there's my scene done in an ink render. And I can save this or render it out using the Quicksilver hardware renderer and get a very neat stylized look. I also have a choice in here of what I'm illuminating, and am I casting ambient occlusion using a screen space occlusion, and also am I using indirect illumination. Again, I'll try a quick render on this and see how it looks. It's compiling the shaders in the background for display in the view. In this way it's, again, much like a game. And there's the render, fairly quick, showing how it looks, and it'll continue to resolve that light as it goes further. But the native display of the shaders is pretty good. I'll cancel this because we had let it sit there and simply soak up time if we wanted. It's neat again to experiment with this renderer, because we have the advantage of being able to use again the power of our graphics card. Now that my scene is back, I'm ready to play with other lighting and rendering. It's always good to experiment with your rendering engines and see what's available. Remember that rendering is an artistic choice, and different renderers produce different looks, which may help you get your point across in different ways in your story. Now we'll start to look at indirect light and bounce light in a scene.